Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here with us. I'm Katie Earle. I coordinate our University Express program, and I work for the Erie County Department of Senior Services. And we're so fortunate to be back again with Claude Welch, who's been involved with our program for a while. And because of virtual realms, we're able to still be connected with him. So thank you, Claude. Some quick housekeeping. We are recording this session. It will be only active speakers, so don't worry about it. It'll just be Claude in the presentation for the majority of the time here on the recording. If you have any questions for Claude as he goes through the presentation, like always, put that in the chat and we'll try to get to as many questions and comments as we can in the time that we have today. The chat is located at the lower right-hand side of your screen if you're on a computer, or it's at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a tablet, touch it, you'll see the circle with 3 dots, and there you'll have it, and I'll also activate the Q&A in a second. But anyways, we hope you participate and have some fun with us today, because who wouldn't want to be traveling virtually on a day like this with all this wind? But quickly, we'll thank our sponsors, my Department of Senior Services, Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield of Western New York, Excelsior Orthopedics, and Wegmans for all their support. And Senior Services is at 858-8526 if you need anything. The star of our show, Claude Welch, holds the ranks of SUNY Distinguished Service Professor and Professor of Political Science Emeritus. He began teaching at UB in 1964 and became well known on the campus for his high-quality teaching and research. His academic specializations include African politics, the role of armed forces in politics, and human rights. Human rights formed his major research focus for the past 40 years. His teaching awards came from political science students, the Undergraduate Student Association, and the Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching. He was named one of UB's top 10 professors by the campus newspaper. He published 14 books and close to 40 chapters and articles in academic journals. In 2006, he received the first ever Lifetime Achievement Award given by TIAA, which is a major annuity fund. He also received Lifetime Achievement Awards from the American Political Science Association, the International Studies Association, and the New York African Studies Association. He received the University of Buffalo's President's Medal in 2016, and he's chaired or served on 60 dissertation committees. He's traveled widely, which we'll learn about today, particularly in Africa, Asia, and Europe, and wove the perspectives of other cultures into his classes, public lectures, and research. His photographs have been donated to the University of Buffalo Digital Image Collection, where they are available for public access, and we'll see some today. Claude, thank you. The floor is yours.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and thank you very much to the Erie County Department of Senior Services for making this possible, also from the various sponsors. I wish I could be doing this in person, but as you know, COVID has intervened, and I'm speaking to you from about 400 miles to the east on I-90. I've moved to a retirement community to be closer to my kids. But what we're going to talk about today is an interesting cruise that my wife and I took from Berlin to Prague, from Germany to one of the largest cities in Europe to one of the smaller but most beautiful cities of all, Prague. So to get started, let's orient ourselves on, with the welcome. That is my wife, Jeanette. She died 3 months after our cruise, so this is dedicated to her. So we wish all of the people tuned in a very hearty welcome, a herzliche Willkommen alles. So as we continue, we'll find some maps here. Here's Berlin. As you can see, it's in the far northeast of Germany as a whole. If the airline distance down to Prague, which is here, it's about 175 miles. So if you go on a straight line with a high-speed train, you can do it in 2 hours, I think, easily. But that's not the way we went. So let's find something called the Elbe River. Here it is flowing out to Hamburg, but with its sources up here in the Czech Republic. So roughly what we're going to do is to go from Berlin to Magdeburg, down the river to Dresden, and so forth. So if you're ready, let's move on and see what we can find. We're in Berlin, and one of the things that's important about that is that it's a big city. It's the most populous one in Europe. It also covers about 350 square miles, So think of it in terms of the city of Buffalo. It's almost over 7 times the size of the city of Buffalo. Distinguishing feature, we'll see the Brandenburg Gate, the Reichstag, which is the parliamentary chamber, and the great big television tower. So let's look a little closer at those. Here's the Brandenburg Gate. There are the two of us celebrating on this wonderful day, but also observing political demonstrations going on. These are Iranian students who are protesting about the lack of freedoms in their own country and thought, oh, okay, here's an ideal place to do so in front of this highly symbolic gate. One of the things that's significant about Berlin is that it's at the junction point of a couple of rivers. So what you have are cruise boats that go up and down in the town itself, and then out further on, to beautiful, cruises like we took. So here we are from Greece, but in the background is the start of what's called Museum Island. And we'll see more of that in a little while. Here's the Reichstag from the side. Reichstag means the Imperial Assembly, or simply the Parliament. It was burned in the early 1930s in a very significant incident, but it's been rebuilt. And so the tower that was destroyed, the top part, is now this open dome where you can walk and you can see the sun is streaming in a subdued way. There's a very sophisticated set of louvers that adjust the lighting and provide electricity to power the whole place. So if we move on, I'm going to show you just a couple of posters that were there. This is commemorating German Social Security. Germany had the first social security system in the world, and they're very proud of that. Another thing here we have news about the Reichstag, buildings in flames, and so forth. What's happening? Well, that was one of the events that helped lead to the Nazis' rise in the 1930s. Here's a map of Germany, which is very interesting because this is from 1949, and when there were different zones. So here is basically West Germany. Here is what became the DDR, or the German Democratic Republic. Not very democratic, it was communist. So here is now Russia. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Russia. And this section was turned over to Poland. But in 1949, you can see one party saying forward for a free Germany, and the other saying all of Germany, it must come about. Well, fat chance. It only came in 1994, not as shown. So here we have a sign from leaving West Berlin with a fallen angel, symbolic of that time. And now here you have your ideas need space to grow. Berlin's got it. It's a really hip city, guys. Think about it for if you have the ability to travel. Here's a view from the Reichstag looking at the cruise boats going down the Havel River. And inside the Tiergarten, which is one of the largest parks in the whole country, you have these, well, what are they? Those are actors, ladies and gentlemen, who are just sitting still. And hopefully you would come up with a couple of euros to say thank you for doing so. But you can also spend your euros for, a nice pretzel. Why not? It's a beautiful summer day, and you can see warm pretzels themselves for 2.5 euros. Might be a little expensive for a pretzel because a euro is worth a fair amount these days. Let's keep on going and find ourselves on Museum Island, but look at the wall here. This has not been repaired, and these are bullet holes because Berlin became a major area for bombing, for fighting, at the very end of World War II itself. So you can see traces of this. But here's a sculpture by the famous East German sculptor, Katie Kollwitz, saying, we do not want war. Let us be free from war, Krieg, as shown there. This is my wife, Reichstag in the background. This is a memorial for people who were killed deliberately by the Nazis. And in this case, what many of us may call the gypsy population, but more correctly, certainly in European terms, are the Sinti and the Roma. So these were seen as people who did not fit the racial purity laws. And here you can see one of many of these stones, remembering the concentration camps and especially the extermination areas that removed about 6 million Jews and a couple of million others from just killed them off in industrial fashion. One of the most interesting memorials to the Holocaust comes in Berlin itself, and this is the Holocaust Memorial. You look and you see all these concrete blocks. Well, what happens? Well, you start to walk, and you walk, and you walk, and you get further and further down. You are surrounded by concrete. It is creepy. It is horrifying. And knowing what happened, just think of the people who did not know how they were being herded into gas chambers and their death. The Jewish cemetery has been restored in the midst of the Jewish quarter. And you can see here the grave of Moses Mendelssohn, grandfather of the famous composer Felix Mendelssohn. He was himself a very fine philosopher. It's traditional there, if you are a visitor, to bring along a small stone and place it, as I am here, at the front of the Jewish cemetery itself. Now this says, as you can see, trains to life, trains to death. What was this? Well, there were so-called children's transports that operated, that moved a small number of young Germans to England. Check that. In fact, one of my good friends where I'm now living actually was on one of these Kindertransporte. But the sculpture itself in bronze commemorates those children who didn't know what was happening. Yes, people are eating lunch, they're not paying attention to it, but it's profoundly moving just to see these figures. People bring flowers regularly to commemorate those who died by going on the transports to death. And imagine there, some young girl or some young person having only a broken doll to try and remember her former life. Now in Germany, cuisine or cooking is interesting. It's not the most tasty in the world, but in West Berlin, there is curry sausage with potatoes. Now, doesn't that sound like a great thing? Here we are mid-morning, maybe it's time for coffee instead. One of the big features in the former West Berlin is the church that was built to commemorate Kaiser Wilhelm I. In German, it's called the Kaiser Wilhelm Gedächtniskirche, which means the Remembrance Church. And let me show a couple of pictures of it, starting with the exterior. This is on one of the big shopping streets of former West Berlin, the Kurfürstendamm, or Kudamm, as it's often called. And within the old part of the church, built at the end of the 19th century, these are all going to be ceiling tiles that we see. Imagine them sparkling with the gold that's been embedded in them, all in commemoration of Christ and also of the secular power that was represented by the German imperial house. Dedication is to Kaiser Wilhelm I. You can see there, King of the Prussians and Emperor of the Germans. He was a man who was in power when Germany became a country. And perhaps some of you know, maybe all of you do, that Germany did not become a country until 1871. In the new part of the cathedral is this wonderful glass window behind the figure of Christ triumphant, as we draw, closer to our Christmas celebration. And of course, we're in the start of Hanukkah at this point. A statue that, if you can't see it, but that's all in Spanish. Now, my goodness, why would you have a Spanish inscription here, some old white dude? Well, this is a guy whose name was von Humboldt, and he was one of the most famous adventurers and writers of all time. He specialized in Latin America and is appropriately commemorated here at Humboldt University. Well, I said Berlin was a naughty city, lots of free life. Here are a pair of posters that sort of portray it. Looking at that, does it remind you guys of Cabaret? If you haven't seen the film Cabaret with Liza Minnelli and Joel Grey, I strongly recommend it. It's a wonderful film itself. Well, I'm going to move here to a squat. A squat is an abandoned building, but in this case, this building has become a real focus for artists. So as you can see from people who are there just doing their email, contemplating the state of the world, whatever, they're in a surrounding that shows why Berlin is very much catered toward a youth generation. It's very expensive, and that's why artists are there in these squats. Although it says don't trust art, well, no. Let's see what it has. That was a pretty strong message. Let's move on to something more nourishing and more appropriate. Let's hear it for life. How's that? That is frightening. And that also speaks to the horrors of war and to the memory of Anne Frank, one of those who perished at Bergen-Belsen. But let's move on and start the cruise itself. We went on the so-called Elbe Princess. The Elbe, again, was this long river that flows from its mouth in the North Sea by Hamburg, the biggest port, one of the biggest ports in Germany, to its sources in Czechoslovakia. We're at the harbor itself, and there's the boat. And look at that, a paddle wheeler. And yes, why a paddle wheeler? It's because the Elbe River, it has an average depth of maybe 10 to 15 feet, if that. It is incredibly shallow, so that boats and ships that go along it have to be very, very cautious. How's that? This is a typical excursion boat that would go around the rivers and lakes of the Berlin area. The Havel and the Spree are the major rivers, and there are many, many lakes as well. We see art on the way. There's my wife, Jeanette, on the right, and our tour guide at the left. Because again, I'm doing this in Jeanette's memory. She won a trivia contest, so had some pretty lousy champagne to celebrate with. Let's start out our first place beyond Berlin to Potsdam. And Potsdam is the capital of the state of Potsdam itself, and Brandenburg. Here is what's called the Charlottenburg Palace. That was built in 1699 by Friedrich I, who was the father of Frederick the Great, a man who I'll mention again in a few moments. And this is quite a structure, as you can see. Heroic picture, of course, of Frederick I in front. That sculpture and statue is really quite impressive. But even more impressive is the palace that he built called Sans-Souci. Now, Sans-Souci is a French word meaning without care. And so you can see the ornate decoration dating from the very start of the 18th century, as I say, 1699 for the construction and the occupation by Frederick I. We'll look more closely and you will see Sans-Souci, again, without care, the big windows designed for the ballroom, for the dining room, and for the other specialties of the nobility. But Frederick the Great, Friedrich der Große, is remembered because he was a very practical ruler. And what do these look like, guys? Yeah, you could be giant peanuts or misshapen eggs, but these are potatoes. And he is famed as the person who brought potatoes to Germany. And when he's established Berlin as the capital for the Brandenburg Margrave, and then for Prussia eventually, and then for Germany, he did so in this far northeast part of the country in an area that was very marshy and wet. So one of the things that he introduced were linden trees, which grow very well in marshy conditions. There are a number of outdoor sculptures in these intriguing spots. You go there and can be sheltered from the rain, but they also provide a nice exhibit space for various sculptures. Now, Potsdam is also known because in 1945, leaders of the major Allied states got together and said, what are we going to do with Germany now it's been defeated? Well, it was the coming on the stage and a real introduction to power for President Harry Truman. And you can see him there with his obviously very staged attempt to get Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill and the militaries of both sides together and agree on what should be done with post-war Europe. Now let's keep on going to a city of Magdeburg, a city that was not too badly damaged in World War II, fortunately, and the damage has been repaired. There are two famous people who come from that city. One of them is Otto von Guericke, who was a scientist, inventor, interested in atmospheric vacuums and electrostatics and so forth. Here he is, in a statue overlooking that particular square. While at the same time, Georg Philipp Telemann is another famous son of the city. If some of you listen to WNED, as I usually have on here in Boston, Massachusetts, you will hear Telemann from time to time. He's held to be the most prolific classical composer of all time, certainly well over 1,000 known compositions. And here's a picture of Magdeburg back in the 17th and 18th century, obviously dominated by churches. This is a Lutheran section of Germany. On the Magdeburg Cathedral are many heroic figures, and I thought this one was especially interesting. Clearly a man who had origins in Africa, doubtless a slave, but one who was now a soldier in the armies of Brandenburg. Show you a couple of sculptures from around the cloister. While those others in my group listen to a lecture, I'm busy wandering around taking pictures because these are ones that you can find in the UB collection that Katie Earle mentioned. So it's a lovely day in the cloister, an opportunity to look closely at the statues and also at the interior of the church. Pretty plain, starts out with some old Romanesque arches, early Gothic and so forth. Not particularly distinguished, except on the outside. And for those of you who know Christian iconography, it's a fancy way of saying, what do those statues mean? These are the 5 foolish virgins. They've done things that are inappropriate and they're suffering and mourning. Meanwhile, facing them are the 5 wise virgins. They know how to run life the right way, with their following their religious teachings. Now, this looks like a little unusual. This is an apartment house, but it came from an Austrian architect who had the incredible name, pardon me while I look at my notes, Friedensreich Regentag Dunkelbunt Hundertwasser, which I'll translate for you. It's a peaceful, rainy day with dark-colored 100 water. Well, what the heck does that mean? It means nothing. But this guy was, clearly inspired to use colors in a very different way in what was a pretty, staid, not laid back, but pretty conventional city. So you walk around and you see examples of Hundertwassers, attempts at color, especially in this area here. Very much fun. Just sort of something to visit in Magdeburg. Here's my wife lighting a votive candle inside the cathedral. I didn't take the picture of what happened about 30 seconds later when she leaned over too far and her hair caught on fire, but that was I was more involved in helping her. The main altar place itself by the lectern, the pulpit, excuse me, sun streaming in, beautiful wood carving. The altar itself, and again, the pulpit, the side with Christ rising triumphant on this magnificent work. And the Virgin. And a repeat, because I like that. And again, from the outside by the cloister with warriors. And okay, the boat's left and we're going to Wittenberg, famous for Katharina von Bora, a nun who married, sound of trumpets, Martin Luther. And this city became very significant in 2017. Here's Wittenberg on the map. Why? Because 500 years earlier, Martin Luther had gone to the cathedral door and tacked up on it a series of questions. There were 95, what he called the 95 theses, and these were intended for debate. But he was a very stubborn guy. He criticized the way that the church was operating in those days. So here is a museum, the original rooms of Martin Luther, the most famous person in the city. I should also note that Wittenberg has a flower festival every year. Its official name is not just Wittenberg anymore, it's Lutherstadt, meaning Luther's city, Wittenberg, hyphenated name. Let's go inside and take a look at Martin Luther. Now, isn't that a god-awful picture, guys? Well, it was painted as a death portrait. So there he is dead. I mean, my Lord. Let's move on quickly and look at one of his major contributions. This is an original of his most famous hymn of many, Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott. A mighty fortress, is our God, and so forth. So that's, something to remember, about Martin Luther. Here is his protector, because he came under attack from the Pope, from Leo X, because of things he did. He was very critical of church practices, especially the efforts to get additional money to build St. Peter's. Here's his workroom with his desk here at the left. You can see the size of the original planks. Again, this is dating from the late 15th century. This is well before 1517. Looks it, doesn't it? There's that huge desk on which he worked, surrounded by people who were studying themselves to be scholars and to be priests in what became the Lutheran Church. How do you keep warm? Well, you have fires going inside this porcelain heater. You don't get too close, but that's the equivalent of a radiator. You can see the chimney here, but one way of providing warmth and sanctity to Luther's place. Here's a replica of the kind of printing press that he used for the hymnals and especially for the posters and pamphlets that became very important. Inside his lower quarters are some pictures that depict important parts in the life of Jesus. And here you have a representation, obviously not very biblically accurate, of the Annunciation. Here's Joseph sleeping as usual, and there is Mary. Looks familiar, but not familiar. And the inside of the cathedral, which you can see, started out as a Romanesque cathedral with these rounded arches. Then they became braver and built the rounded arches up. And by the time they reached the ceiling, they had figured out how to be full Gothic and to have a beautiful ceiling. Well, Germans are pretty good at recycling. So not only do you have some lousy champagne here, but here's an example of Martin Luther endorsing, if you will, some German drink, a very bitter drink that I don't recommend, but some people, use it as a dash. Who's she? Well, it's our guide holding up a little figure of Martin Luther with his pen. A powerful image of Lutherstadt, Wittenberg, a combined city. Let's go to Dresden. Dresden was a beautiful city. It was the capital for the Dukes of Lower Saxony. But this church itself, the Frauenkirche, or our Virgin Church, was destroyed in World War II, but it's been restored. The first time that Jeanette and I saw this church was in 1994, and it was just a bunch of blocks of stone bearing numbers, because with computer analysis, they were able to figure out what stone would go where in the reconstruction. So the rebuilding started in 1994 and finished in 2005. Here's the Opera House, there in Dresden. Again, an example of the kind of overblown, heavy art, but the recollection and honoring of the opera. Here is an area called the Orangerie, or the Zwinger, Z-W-I-N-G-E-R, built in 1701. and 1709, excuse me. And what were these corridors for? Well, in the summertime, this whole area would be filled with potted plants like palm trees, which could survive most seasons of the year, but come the German winter, inside the palm trees went. So there we are, the swinger. This again was terribly damaged in World War II. There's a lovely portrait gallery here, as you can see, advertising the old masters. There we go, some more, pictures. All of them, yours would blend in nicely. Here würde gut dazu passen. So there we have Lutherstadt Magdeburg. Give you a few more images. Here is what the Frauenkirche, the Virgin's Church, looked like after this firebombing raid in 1945. I would say that Soviet troops were about 3 or 4 days away from taking the city, and the bombing of Dresden was interpreted by many as a kind of revenge bombing for Coventry and so forth. We'll conclude our visit to Dresden with this march of the various Saxon kings. So here is a representation of Frederick the Great, Friedrich der Große. So he is preceded by others who are heroic in this tile. These are all tiles, guys, 23,000 of them, showing rulers of this area from 1127 and 1904. Big parade there in Dresden in the former East Germany. Let's take a couple of views of the Saxony's Alps. Saxony, again, an area of Eastern Germany. There are 3 different Saxonies. I won't bother you with the emphasis of them, but here are the different parts of Saxony. Let's take a look at this area that became very romantic. Well, we're going along the Elbe River very slowly. We're averaging about 8 miles an hour, so we're not covering things very quickly. And all of a sudden, we look up on the hill at the sort of a very defensible area. And there we find the start of Swiss, Saxony, Swiss. We'll see the trains going by on one side of the river are basically for freight trains, and the other side for passenger trains. Sensible division. And at the top, what had been a fortress is now transformed into a restaurant. So let's, experience a festival, with fine culinary and, great events. It's kind of German that's pretty easy to read, fortunately. You can get a fine brunch there, of course, again, at a highly inflated price. If you're willing to blow $40 on brunch, but go ahead. But most people come to the national park because it is really gorgeous with its views. Bring along your dog, and there's the bar for the Hunde, meaning dog, okay? And I suppose you'd all say, Wunderbar, Hundebar. Okay, thank you. Carl Caspar Friedrich and other German artists saw the Saxony Alps as a real basis for romantic painting. So here's a romantic painting visualizing what the artist saw. But here's the reality. You look from this commanding point to the north, and you can see the river in that direction. Looking toward the south, here's another view. And again, look at these rocks. Can you imagine getting up those? A highly defensible position, the equivalent of Omaha Beach in Normandy that the brave Marines stormed in World War II. Again, just seeing this defensible position, but also these unusual rocks that have been eroded over time. It just is a gorgeous sight, really fun to walk around. Take the convenient bridges that have been constructed, get the views again of the rocks, or go back to the old fortress on top. This is the area that's been transformed for brunch. Most of it is closed. The old doors from the 18th century are still there again, but this is no longer militarily active. So here we are, final stages of the trip. The flag of this boat, it's an unusual flag. It's the flag of Luxembourg. Well, How did it get here? Luxembourg's a very good place to invest in. I took this picture for my son-in-law, who's a geologist. And what an interesting example of, look at this. Here are these various layers of rock, these strata, and they've been heaved up practically to a right angle. But it'll just show you what happens in geologic time as the earth, changes and plates collide and so forth. Mountains are built and destroyed. Well, I said that the boat itself was from the Luxembourg, but every person on the crew, with the exception of the chef, were Hungarian. Oh, my goodness, not German, but Hungarian. So here I am ready to disembark. We'll have a moment before we get off in the Czech Republic, because we have now left Germany. We are into the Czech Republic itself, looking at tributaries, watching some of the campers who come on the side, and we arrive at Litomerice in the Czech Republic. There's a rendition of Czechoslovakia using the national flag as the background. So we're basically about here, as we've come in from the northwest, via the Elbe River. Now it's changed names. The Germans call it the Moldau in this area. So what's this town noted for? Well, let's get off first. Watch out for the joggers on the path nearby. Let's go for a walk through the old town itself. Gorgeous, untouched by World War II, like Prague itself. Food trucks selling, not chicken wings, but much larger parts. But let's go into the old city and take a quick look at its cathedral. All of it done in magnificent silver or gilt is just as gorgeous sign. But it's also a center in the Saxony Alps for travel, for people who want to go jogging or do Pilates or other fitness, who want to go hiking, cycling, and so forth. I took this picture because Jeanette and I felt really at wit's end because we don't know those languages, the Slavic languages. So we did. You'll see lots of pictures of signs. Here we have something called Eat Here. So let's take a look and see what it provides. Well, it provides lots of beer named for the brewery Labut, which means swan. So here we are in a shop or pub of the Swan Brewery. Jeanette looking at the menu itself. She is or was quite a drinker of beer, a real connoisseur of it. So beer brewed right on the site. You can see it. And here's a tour group there sitting, getting their liters of beer. Well, most of us were American, and we don't do a good job in 10 minutes of finishing that much beer. I will say that Jeanette and I managed to quaff it down pretty quickly, and it was a wonderful. Czech beer is the best in the world, and the Czechs know it. They drink an average of 135 liters a year of beer. 130, and this does include kids. So beer belongs, enjoy it. You can also go, of course, in the city and get things that sound familiar, like a panini or tortellini or a salad, but what's all that? Maybe there are some people who are still speaking Polish and could watch that, fine. Back to the cathedral, the exterior, but let's go to Prague. So here is the manhole cover, stormwater collection, the seal of the city. Prague was untouched by World War II. It has an old history, a bridge across the Vltava, that's the Czech name, or the Germans call it the Moldau. Classical music fans will know very well from Bohemia's forests and meadows, the famous suite of which the Moldau forms part. Well, there's a view from the old city itself, looking at these blocks of buildings. Here's the St. Vitus Cathedral we'll go closer to, a big TV tower, but let's go down and explore the old city itself and get to the castle in Prague. The castle in Prague is 750,000 square feet. It's said to be the largest castle in the world, but this castle obviously had plenty of space for dining, for recreation, for enjoying the life that you find with people of a high estate. They also heated, of course, with these porcelain stoves. Very interesting, I thought, quite unusual, some of the design. Prettier than some of the old steam radiators that we have in the older houses in Buffalo. And in the church itself of St. Vitus, we'll see just abundant splendor in the windows, on the altar, above the altar itself, all done in this magnificent silver that's just really special to look at. The altar itself, close up with Christ with the cross as a representation. And moving on outside, some contemporary sculptures showing the emotions of the time, commemorating the imperial past. And here is the front of the Cathedral of St. Vitus, and this is the part of Wenceslas Square, the traditional gathering point for citizens of the city. And as you can see on this lovely day, thronged with tourists. Paris and Prague, cities that I urge you to visit. Certainly Berlin is fascinating, as I hope you've seen. You can get around by horse if you want to be sort of the true tourist and see the cathedral and so forth from different points of view. But in concluding our look at Prague, should recognize that it is in this river valley that's warm and protected so that grapes can grow. Now, if you think of Czechoslovakia as being an area for production of beer, well, there are some vineyards as well, and there's the proof of them. I'm going now and finishing up by looking at the Jewish quarter of the city. Before we get there, let's take a look at some puppets that were on display, very much a lively art in Europe. Sometimes they're grotesque, sometimes they're funny. Certainly, you will see Punch and Judy shows performed, Grand Guignol, and so forth. But let's take a look at the Municipal House, a late 19th century palace that is a wonderful performing arts center with, how's that, ladies? This is the entrance to the ladies' room. The men get similar treatment, but let's just look at these porcelain walls and just get an idea of what surrounds the people who come into the lower level of this municipal hall before going to concerts upstairs. Interesting. I hope you find this. But if you don't want to go by a horse, check these other, sort of tourist vehicles. Interesting. What are they? They're just basically rebuilt Volkswagens. Take the Volkswagen body shell off, slap this on, lengthen the wheelbase a little bit, set it up. Boy, charge 40 euros for an hour ride or less. Why not? Prague is a city where, of course, there is drinking, and unfortunately, of course, outside drinking and attempt to control that. Here's the Jewish quarter itself, cramped, ghetto-like conditions, but, here was one of the most interesting prose artists of the 20th century, Franz Kafka. So this is Kafka's house looking in the window of one of the two rooms that you can see. He lived very simply and was impoverished through most of his life. He's most noted for a book called The Metamorphosis. And some of you may have read it, but the main character, a guy named Grigor Samsa, wakes up one morning and he's under the couch. He's not in his bed. He has been transformed into a beetle. So how do you deal with life when you're a beetle as opposed to being a human? Well, here is where Kafka wrote in this little tiny desk, in this little tiny space, his chamber pot, where he did his cooking. As you can see, life was very simple and very difficult for him. And here is a statue of Franz Kafka, it says down there, sort of portraying his view of humanity as being a kind of empty shell. And here he is observing and trying to say, hey guys, here's what life is like. But here's a view, from the top of the Municipal Tower. A lot of steps to walk up, but why not? As a view and a way of ending up our tour as we look at St. Vitus Cathedral once again. And we go back to our boat. It's late afternoon, when shadows are long. It's time, with these storm clouds gathering, to say goodbye to Prague, goodbye to the end, and thank you very much. I appreciate your watching this with me. Thank you, and I'd love, in the 15 minutes or so we have, to take any questions or comments, direct them through Katie, who's been following the chats, and I turn it over to her. Katie, to you.
Well, thank you, Claude, for that wonderful trip and journey. Wow, that was fabulous. Felt like I was there. So a couple questions. The first one I'm seeing is, how long was your trip? I'm sorry if I missed that in the beginning.
The direct airline distance between Berlin and Prague is 175 miles, but we certainly did not take it in the straight route. I would say we probably covered about 250 miles. Almost all of it was on this boat with a capacity of 70 people. We are the only American groups. All of the others were French speaking. Part of our trip was on a canal. And as I mentioned, I believe earlier, I think our average speed was about 8 miles an hour. There were a couple of locks that we had to go through. And there was one occasion when we were on a canal and we went underneath the Elbe River. I mean, check that. It's really unusual. So 250 miles to answer the question. Thank you for that.
And was it like 1 week, 2 weeks long?
It was a week.
Okay.
It was ideally timed during the Easter break. Jeanette and I had just retired from teaching. This is April of 2018. And it was a way of saying, oh, we love to travel. We wish we could bring the memories of these back, to what we teach.
Awesome. Claude, someone's wondering, how did you book this?
My wife saw it on a travel site and she said, hey, I'd like to go. So are you interested in going as well? Even if you don't, I'm going to do it. So we signed up. It was very interesting to be on this boat that was basically French speaking, because we could speak French and get along with the folks there and have a good conversation with the chef staff. The chief chef was a guy from the island of Guadeloupe in the West Indies, and he was very obviously of African descent, but was trained as in the highest art of French cooking. There's something about having real croissant and pain au chocolat in the morning as a good way to start off, plus excellent coffee.
I'm sure. What awesome memories. The next question is, what was your favorite part?
My favorite part, that's very hard. I would say it was Dresden, because having seen it, several years earlier when the destruction of the war was still obvious. I didn't mention it at the time, but the government of East Germany deliberately did not rebuild the cathedral. Why? Because they were secular, militantly so, and they wanted to show the way in which this beautiful city had been laid waste by Allied bombers. So it was a political statement not to rebuild, just as it was a political statement by the newly reunified Germany to rebuild the cathedral and restore it to the glory that it had in 1850 and so forth.
Wow, thank you for the history information, Claude. So we're getting into comments now. I have bravo, very informative and interesting.
Thank you.
We have, I've been to Germany several times and visited many of the places in Berlin that you showed. It was great to see them again. I've not been to the other cities you've depicted, so I enjoyed seeing your photos and hearing your descriptions. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then I'm seeing, so cool, thanks for letting me see places I'd never see.
I hope you get the chance to see them in person, everybody. It's easy to travel. You have the advantage of speaking a language that is pretty widely spoken, especially in cities like these which are used to handling tourists. And you can always find tours. Doesn't have to be on a slow-moving boat, but with people who know the local language and can get around, it's really helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claude. And we'll just close with this comment. It's how wonderful. You are so interesting. And I thank you for spending time with us and taking us on your trip. I could listen to you all day. I agree. And can see why you've gotten so many teaching awards. Wish I had been in your classes. Please come again.
I shall. Thank you very much for the invitation, Katie. Thank you so much to the Department of Senior Services for this opportunity.
You are so welcome, Claude. We appreciate you. And thank you to everyone who is on. Enjoy the rest of your day.